Who were the most prominent physical chemists at the point when you guys came on the scene?
Well, when I started there, certainly the most prominent was George Scatcherd. He was a member of the National Academy, and he'd won the Richards Medal of the Northeastern Section. So he was, but he was near retirement. The others in that part of physical chemists.
Stockmeyer and Amder.
And Amder, I knew Amder pretty well because he often had, well, not often, daily, the physical chemists would gather in his office. They'd bring their lunch, and that was an enjoyable kind of social gathering. Sometimes very chemically oriented in discussion, sometimes, of course, political or otherwise. But Amder was sort of this focal point of the physical chemists, as I'm remembering it. Dick Lord was a spectroscopist that Cope had hired, and he was a great guy too. I don't know what interaction you might have had with him, but I had a lot. I had quite a lot. And let's see, who else was there in the Stockmeyer. He went off to Dartmouth
yeah.
At some later time. I meant to look up and see when he left, but in any event, he was a very well-known physical chemist. Who am I leaving out?
Stockmeyer always had a sense of humor, playing jokes on people. There's a famous joke he played on Al Cotton. Al Cotton was feuding with the American Chemical Society because they had, given him a hard time on some of his papers. And so he was sending all his manuscripts to the British Chemical Society. And Stockmeyer got wind of this and got some stationery from JACS, and who was the editor at that
Probably
time?
Noyes.
Noyes, right, Noyes was
And
editor.
the whole project was also involving John Waugh, wasn't it?
It was Stockmeyer's idea.
Was it?
But using stationery from the JACS, they wrote to Al saying, well, Noyes wrote, I'm old and about ready to retire, and we have to get some new blood in, and would you be interested in becoming editor of JACS? And Al said, oh, wow, thanks. But I'm really too young, I'm too active in research, I really wouldn't have time for that. And so Noyes gets this letter from Al, and he writes, Noyes writes to Cope, he says, what's going on in your department? And everybody knew about it but Al.
I imagine he just picked up the phone. Noyes probably and he was at the University of Rochester.
Yeah.
Probably picked up the phone and called Cope. I bet he did.
How was Al's sense of humor?
Oh.
He'd take that well? Al Cotton?
I never heard how he took that or how he found out about it.
He had a pretty big ego, and my guess is that didn't sit well with him. But I don't know. It didn't cause any. Mm-hmm. I have no recollection of any animosity between him and Stocky. He probably just grimaced and realized he'd been taken for that.
Now, one of you mentioned Lester Hamilton, executive officer under Cope. So who was he, and what was his role?
Well, he was the executive officer. He was really in the analytical division. He's probably one of the few people who would be prominent in the MIT chemistry department who did not have a PhD. And I remember Clark Stevenson, that's sort of bothered him. I don't know why it should bother anyone. But Lester Hamilton was the acting chairman during the war, and they raised the question of him continuing after it. But he said, no, we need somebody different. And he did a lot of work. He actually was the advisor to the chemistry majors. I do remember that, because I took over a role of that from Lester Hamilton.
And he was in charge of the administration of the freshman chemistry teaching or a lab program.
Wow, I didn't
All
know
the
that.
TAs went through Hamilton.
He did a lot. It was interesting to me as you think about the headquarters. The headquarters was on the 3rd floor of Building 2, right at that where the stairs come up. My office was 2215 on the 2nd floor, right on that same general location.
So this is the intersection of Building 6 and Building 2?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
That
And
stairwell there, yeah.
And so on the 3rd floor, on the side nearer, sort of towards the library, well, that is the only side there would be by that stairwell. Cope was chair, that was head of the department. Lester Hamilton was in an office right adjacent to it. Seems to me it was Harriet Hugard, who was the secretary for Cope, and Doris Courier, who was the secretary for Hamilton, and they were all very efficient, effective people. There was one other person, as I remember, who was in an adjacent office, who was a financial officer, but those 3 people, Cope, Hamilton, and I don't remember the name of the financial
Hamilton
person.
was sort of chief of staff.
You know, they just ran the shop with these 2 people we'd now call administrative assistants, and very, very capable people. So when you see how it increased in size, I think it's not just Parkinson's law. I think that so many other things became important with the financial matters and proposals. That all be ballooned in size and need as the subsequent years. But that was what the headquarters was at that time in 1953. And I think it stayed that way for years. We took on some additional people assisting mainly with financial things, and some of the things that Hamilton did, the faculty took over. I took over quite a bit with the advising to the chem majors. And
Hamilton would assign office space to the new faculty and get some old broken down desks and chairs.
Oh, I don't remember that.
We did not live in splendor.
Did you actually have an office initially, or did you just have a little lab of your own?
Jack Irvin was away as ONR representative in London, so his office was available, and I got put in that, right up with the radio chemists.
Well, I'm trying to remember where you were when you came in 57. That's 4 years after I did, but I don't remember having much contact with the inorganic people.
Yeah,
where
where
was your lab?
Floor, up on the 4th floor.
Of Building
6.
And did you have an office there? I assume
As I said, I was using Jack Irvin's office.
But I mean, when he came back, were you then in?
Then I got moved down to the 3rd floor in some of the space that Morton had
Oh, I see.
vacated. I still didn't have an office. I had an office lab.
Oh.
Which buildings was the chemistry department occupying? And this is all before 1969 to 70 when the Dreyfus Building 18 opened.
We had a lot of space in building, 6, building 6.
And building 2.
And building 2, the main part of 2 ran down towards the river. It was mathematics people in there. There's some labs down in the basement. I think John Waugh and others had many labs in the spec lab, the what is it called, the Harrison spectroscopy lab. That Dick Lord was, I think, in charge of that. So the research space and the offices were mainly, I think, in 6 and then a lot down in the basement. Not on the 1st floor. Key's office, which was a very handsome wood-paneled space, I think was taken over by the Dean of Science.
Right.
1st floor of Building 6.
On the 1st floor, but there was a lot of other things sort of
Those
clustered
big
around
labs
there.
where the undergraduate labs were, and what was Building 4, was that? Organic? labs there, great big labs.
The third floor of that connector, not a short connector thing, between building 6 and then down through 2, and then it's building 4. Isn't that the thing there? John Sheehan was on the 3rd floor of that thing, and Herb House and I shared an office from '53 for the first 4 years or so, and a very amicable arrangement. I got along very well.
This is building 2.
In building 2,
Yeah,
2,
that short
215. It's not too short a thing, and those things both on the 2nd floor, and there was a corridor, a center corridor, which is not there now. But there was a great big undergraduate teaching lab on one side, on the river side, and there was a great big undergraduate teaching lab on the inside of that 2nd floor.
Right.
And then on the 3rd floor, those were all chemistry research space. John Sheehan was up there, and then you moved into
Dietmar
that
was
area
there.
later.
Yes, when I arrived at MIT, those teaching labs were there, and Dietmar's lab was above on the 3rd floor.
Yeah.
I meant short only in that the longer part of building 2, which is math, extends from 6 toward the river.
And I think that, I don't remember any chemistry
But maybe in the
things
basement.
down in that, but in the basement,
Yeah.
definitely yes.
Yeah.
How was research funding when you arrived, Fred?
Well, very, very different from some decades later, or maybe not so many years later. But at that point, the COPE certainly made it certain that you would have available funds from which you would have an account number, and your graduate students could buy, could get equipment and chemical supplies from that. I don't remember having a limit on how much I had, but I didn't have very many needs either. And a lot of things you had to bake, like constant temperature baths, they were not really commercially available at that. But I knew how to do that, how to make a constant temperature bath for research, because I was doing kinetics. I needed to know that kind of thing. But I don't remember being needing to go to COPE and say, look, I need some more money for this. Do you?
When I arrived, this was just after Sputnik. I arrived in August of '57. Sputnik went up October 4th. And all of a sudden, a lot of money was available. So I started out with a Navy grant, which supported a number of students. I had a couple of students already when I walked in the door because they had been unassigned previously and signed up with me. So I had a functioning research operation right from the start, which apparently was not the case in years before.
Was there something called Research Corporation? I may have the name wrong, but there were some things that catered to people who were just starting. So that was it was not much money.
Small grants, yeah.
Small grants. But as Dietmar was saying, the Sputnik made a huge difference, because in the years following that, it was possible for a graduate student to, well, let me go back a moment. The main sources for anybody doing research were the National Science Foundation, or the National Institutes of Health, or the Department of Energy. I think there was already one of those, or the Department of Defense. And I guess the naval thing supported a lot of work over in physics department, and also, so that was a standard way that established people would generate money. But after Sputnik, it was possible for a student, not in their first year they would have been teaching assistants, and that would have covered their tuition and a stipend, I guess, as it does now. I assume it does. But in their second year, they would all be research assistants, and then that would be money that you'd have to raise, basically, or they could continue to be teaching assistants.
How about faculty salaries? Do you remember what your starting salaries were?
I think I got $500 a month.
And I got about 5,000 a year, which is, there would be six in 4 years. But there, in terms of, you used the word startup package.
Cope gave me a refractometer. He said, "Do you need anything?" I said, "In a refractometer." I was working with liquids and doing molar refractions for identification purposes. So he gave me a refractometer.
A new one.
A new one,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, he gave us, I think for Herb House and myself and Norm Nelson, I don't know whether we're all on the same account number, but there was an account number which provided the necessary supplies for the research groups to make it possible to do research. With regard to equipment, I don't think we bought any big things. We made various things like constant temperature baths.
Did you have graduate students right from the start?
I did not. The Herb House had one of the entering graduate students in the fall of '53. I had 3 seniors who worked for me, and they were up on, I think, I don't know, they're on that 4th floor. Sometimes the seniors, maybe they were all in this great big lab that had about 24 different desks. The one that formerly had been an organic chemistry undergraduate teaching laboratory. And so Herb House's students and Norm Nelson's and mine were all in that one great big room. The hood space was quite limited, only at opposite ends of that very large space. And then there was a small room beyond that, which was for other kinds of instrumentation. What would we have there? Probably an IR instrument and maybe a UV, a Beckman UV. We used that quite a lot. And NMR came in later, well, pretty close to that. It was starting at that point. I don't know when the department first got an NMR machine, and maybe we'll...
Well, when I started, I needed NMRs, and I went to John Wan. We did some joint papers, as a matter of, as a result. So I have, I guess, 3 papers with John Wan.
But the funding for those bigger things was always done through the National Science Foundation, principally, wasn't it? And you'd have to apply for it as a group application from the department. That was the pattern right from that point on. They were too expensive for an individual group to have. I do remember one thing that always pleased me about Klaus Beeman. He came on the faculty in, I think around '57.
Right.
And again, starting, I guess, as assistant. And he was really organic chemistry in his background, but he was very interested in getting into the area of mass spectrometry. And he made notably fine contributions in that area over the ensuing years. But the thing that probably was the most help to him in his career was that he needed a mass spectrometer. Now we're talking really big dollars. And I remember from Klaus, because Klaus and I shared offices, not always in the same place, but from the time we retired about the same time. So I was sharing offices with Klaus over a good many years. But I do remember him saying that he needed a mass spectrometer. It might have been something like 100,000 at that time. And he told Cope of his need. And Cope did come up with the money for that. I think the whole money situation there was there were some big dollars that would come from higher up outside of the chemistry department, because that's a very big amount for that time. But I remember Klaus saying that Art Cope told him, I don't know how soon at that, probably some years later, he said buying that instrument for Klaus Beeman was one of the best investments he ever made. And of course he made quite a lot of money on the stock market, but But that pleases me that he made that kind of a comment to Klaus.
It's too bad Art Cope died early. He was
Yeah.
only 56 when he died, right?
He died in 1966. I was in England on leave that year, and it was in May when I got some word from, I guess, a cable or something from Glenn Birchtold, who was was head of the department at that time. And I think Cope was born in 1909.
Yeah.
So he was.
Now he was no longer head. He was
No.
No,
forced
at that
out.
point he was.
What was the story there?
Well, that's sort of a long story, and it goes back to the Zacharias committee. I don't know whether you want us to launch into that at this point.
Well, I think we might.
I could abbreviate it
Yeah.
to just say that the Zacharias committee proposed a major change in the core requirement in the undergraduate curriculum, which had been 2 years of math, 2 years of physics, 1 year of chemistry plus lab, and then some humanities requirement. The Zacharias committee met for 2 years. I was on that, the second of those two. Carl Garland was a chemistry representative the first year. And I think it was 64, 65 that I was on it. That committee recommended, after deliberations of a committee, must have had 6 or 7 people on it, representing many other areas of MIT, to be sure, and their report recommended a change from 2 years of math to 1 year. This is required of every MIT person getting a degree. Instead of 2 years of physics, 1 year of physics. Instead of 1 whole year of chemistry with lab, 1 semester of chemistry without lab. And that was a big, the faculty voted that.
You and Carl didn't fight that in the committee?
No, in fact, we didn't even favor it. As the time went on, just looking at the situation broadly, we knew that Cope was not going to be at all happy about that, and Cope was sufficiently unhappy that got voted, that he was very inflexible on that issue.
Well, how about you and Carl in the committee? Didn't you fight that?
For about no, I would say we did not. I don't remember of thinking that was the right thing for all MIT people, everybody getting a degree from MIT. I mean, if they're cutting everything in half, it seemed not the right thing to me. That's my strong recollection of it. I think the first year was gathering information about what these new things would be if you're going to change physics and math from 2 years each down to 1 year. What are you talking about putting in that 1 year? And there are a lot of other things that enter into that. But
What was Cope's objection?
Well, he just said you can't teach a decent chemistry subject. Everybody needs to know a year's worth of chemistry, and it has to be done with a lab. And I think for people going into biology and or chemistry or interest in medicine, that makes good sense. But they will take it anyway. To require all of the people in the engineering areas, mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, a huge department of MIT, it just did not strike us that was the proper course of action for people who were not going on in anything where they would ever really need chemistry.
But Cope really didn't have any say, I guess. I mean, he may have been opposed to this in
well,
principle.
He was sufficiently inflexible on the issue that and what else would have entered into that?
One of his major problems with that was that he lost all his TAs. There was no chemistry. And we had lots of TAs in freshman chemistry before. And those helped fund the department.
So what happened, do you recall, when this change was instituted? How did it affect the faculty, the number of grad students? Was there an immediate consequence?
I think there was not. And as we mentioned earlier, this was happening, well, it was some years after the Sputnik era.
64 to
So
65.
I'd say that 64, 65 was still pretty easy times for raising money through these other things we mentioned.
Now, did many of the
NSF.
grad students have their own fellowships? NSF
Quite
or
a few
other?
did through these, because it was so easy to get these NSF pre-doctoral fellowships. If you got one of those, and you could, maybe we mentioned this earlier, I can't remember whether we covered this earlier today or not, but the student could apply for an NSF pre-doctoral fellowship in their second year, and they would, likely it would be funded. And once funded, if the person were making decent progress in research, it would be just simple to recommend that this continue. So they would then be funded through the PhD degree, which was more often, I think, 4 years, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Some in 3.
In the late 60s, most of our students in organic and inorganic chemistry were funded by these fellowships, NSF and NIH.
Yes.
And I had a fairly large research group and didn't have to pay for any of my students.
And that's why this wasn't such a big deal to lose the TAs because many were needed to have 1,000 students taking lab. And there would be other TAs in the running recitation sections for that whole group. So, but I don't remember that turning out to be such a serious issue. So although it was definitely something on Cope's mind, I think he just thought that people needed to know more chemistry, and that one could certainly make a case for that. But it wasn't something that seemed to me necessarily the best thing for the Institute as a whole, while
Right.
physics and math are willing to do the necessary thing to decrease the thing. And let me say another thing about that, because when you have 2 years of physics, 2 years of math, 1 whole year of chemistry, that's basically the core plus some humanities, you lock up most of the first 2 years of the undergraduate teaching program. And that was a main reason for concluding, can we do this by cutting the things in half?
And the engineers were really pissed off because they weren't getting a crack at the entering students because they were so tied up with those courses.
Right.
So
I see.
engineering was really behind this
Yeah.
change.
Some things haven't changed.
Yeah.
So Cope didn't resign. He was fired. Is
He
that
was,
right?
he was
That must
replaced.
have been rather dramatic, because I don't recall any case in any department
No.
in recent years where a department head was literally fired. Must have been a shock to people.
And I think,
Did you have any
maybe he
sense
was-
that was going to happen, or?
I think he was less effective in the job of being head of the department in those years. He died, as I say, in '66, and so we're talking about, I think he was replaced in maybe '64 or no, maybe '65. In any event, Glenn Birchdold became acting chair for '65, '66, and then I think John Ross became chair from around '66 to '70 or so. So that the I've heard some comments about Cope being drinking excessively, and he was very active in the American Chemical Society. He was president of that.
So John Ross came from Brown as a physical chemist. Was his style very different from that of Cope? How did things change at that point? We're talking now about the
late 60s to 1970 or so.
Well, it was more democratic.
Yes,
Everybody was involved.
and we would have faculty meetings and appointments, promotions.
We had an appointment committee.
All went through the whole chemistry faculty. In fact, they had to have pretty much 100% backing of a person for them to be promoted or even brought in. We didn't bring in, well, we brought in some important contributors, but it's a little later, isn't it? So Masamune, Orm Johnson, Lippard, Joanne Stubbe. I think that we're all talking about someone later than this period you're talking about. But it just is, as Steve Marson said, the whole process became a more shared thing between the whole faculty.